Viewers' discretion is advised.
Imagine this. You're walking down a quiet street at night. The air is cool. The world is still. Streetlights cast long shadows, and your footsteps echo softly against the pavement. But somewhere out there, hidden in the darkness, a predator lurks. Not just any predator, but a serial killer. Someone who has taken countless lives, left families shattered, and yet, they're free. Right now, living among us, blending into the crowds. Their pasts buried in whispers and headlines. In this video, we're diving into the chilling stories of 3 serial killers who committed unthinkable crimes and, against all odds, walked free. Their stories will shock you, haunt you, and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. Buckle up, because this is Serial Killers Who Walk Free, the chilling truth. Issei Sagawa, the Kobe cannibal. Our first story takes us across the globe to the romantic, cobblestone streets of Paris, France, where a young Japanese student named Issei Sagawa committed a crime so grotesque, so unthinkable, it defies comprehension. Known as the Kobe cannibal, Sagawa didn't just kill. He ate his victim, fulfilling a lifelong fantasy that had haunted him since childhood. And yet, he didn't spend a lifetime in prison. Instead, he became a celebrity, a twisted icon who turned his infamy into a career. This is the chilling tale of a man who turned his darkest desires into reality and walked away free. Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949 in Kobe, Japan, into a wealthy and influential family. His father was a successful businessman, his mother a devoted homemaker, and their home was a place of privilege and refinement. From the outside, Issei's life seemed charmed. He was small and frail, often described as delicate, but his intellect was sharp. He excelled in school, particularly in literature, and dreamed of studying abroad. But beneath his polished exterior, Issei was battling a darkness that had taken root in childhood. He was obsessed with cannibalism, a fixation that began when he was just a boy. As a child, Issei would lie awake at night, his mind consumed by vivid, disturbing fantasies. He imagined being boiled alive in a giant cauldron alongside his younger brother, a scene inspired by fairy tales Hansel and Gretel or Sleeping Beauty. But in Issei's twisted version, the beautiful princess wasn't someone to save. She was someone to eat. He saw her as a divine being, a figure of beauty and power whose flesh could grant him strength, love, even immortality. These weren't passing thoughts. They were obsessions, growing stronger with each passing year, gnawing at the edges of his mind. By his teens, Issei knew his desires were abnormal. He was ashamed, terrified of what they meant, but he couldn't stop them. He sought help, confessing his cannibalistic urges to a psychotherapist in Japan. The sessions were a rare glimpse into his inner world, a place of chaos and longing. He described his fantasies in detail, hoping for relief, but the therapist could offer little beyond listening. The urges didn't fade, they intensified. Issei began to fixate on specific people, classmates or strangers whose beauty captivated him. He would watch them from a distance, imagining what it would be like to eat them, to make them a part of him forever. In 1977, at the age of 28, Issei's academic ambitions took him to Paris, where he enrolled at the Sorbonne to study comparative literature. Paris was a dream come true, a city of art, culture, and endless possibilities. For most students, it would have been a chance to reinvent themselves. For Issei, it was a hunting ground. He was captivated by the women he met, particularly Western women, whom he saw as embodiments of the fairy tale princesses from his childhood. Their height, their features, their confidence. They were everything he wasn't, and he wanted to possess them in the most literal way. In 1981, Issei met René Hardevelt, a 25-year-old Dutch student who was studying at the Sorbonne. René was everything Issei idolized. Tall, blonde, intelligent, and kind. She was a gifted linguist, fluent in multiple languages, and her warmth put people at ease. Issei was smitten, though his feelings were less about love and more about obsession. He befriended her, charming her with his intellect and quiet demeanor. Renee, unaware of the danger, saw him as a harmless classmate, someone who shared her passion for literature. Issei began inviting Renee to his small apartment in Paris's 16th arrondissement, asking her to help him with German lessons. It was a pretext, a way to get her alone. Renee, trusting and generous, agreed. On June 11, 1981, she arrived at his apartment, carrying a book of German poetry. They sat at his table, reading verses aloud, the atmosphere calm and scholarly. But Issei had other plans. As Renee read, he retrieved a .22 caliber rifle he'd hidden in the room. He aimed at the back of her neck and pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening, the bullet piercing her spine. Renee collapsed, dead before she hit the floor. What happened next is almost too horrific to describe. Issei didn't stop at murder. He raped Renee's body, an act of violation that revealed the depth of his depravity. Then, over the next 2 days, he fulfilled his lifelong fantasy. He carved off 15 pounds of her flesh, carefully selecting pieces from her thighs, arms, and torso. He cooked some of it, seasoned it, and ate it. Other pieces he consumed raw, savoring the taste he dreamed of for so long. He later described the experience in chilling detail, saying, "I killed her and I ate her flesh." For Issei, this wasn't just a crime. It was a ritual, a moment of transcendence that made him feel alive. But his crime was about to catch up with him. Issei knew he couldn't keep Renee's body in his apartment. He dismembered her remains, packing them into 2 suitcases. On June 13th, he took a taxi to the Bois de Boulogne, a large park in Paris, intending to dump the suitcases in a lake. But he was clumsy, nervous, and the suitcases were heavy. Passers-by noticed him struggling, saw blood seeping from the bags, and alerted the police. When officers confronted him, Issei didn't deny what he'd done. He confessed everything, recounting the murder and cannibalism in a calm, emotionless voice that unnerved everyone in the room. The police were horrified. They searched his apartment, finding bloodstains, knives, and remnants of Renee's body in the refrigerator. The case made headlines across France, the public reeling at the brutality of the crime. It seemed like an open and shut case. Surely, Issei Sagawa would spend the rest of his life behind bars, locked away for his monstrous act. But that's not what happened. In a stunning twist, a French judge declared Issei clinically insane and unfit to stand trial. The ruling was based on psychiatric evaluations that described him as a danger to himself and others, driven by delusions and an untreatable obsession. Instead of prison, Issei was sent to a psychiatric hospital in France. His wealthy family, desperate to protect their name, hired top lawyers and pulled strings behind the scenes. In 1984, they secured his deportation to Japan, arguing he would receive better care in his home country. Once in Japan, Issei was admitted to a mental hospital in Tokyo. But a bureaucratic oversight changed everything. The French authorities failed to send the necessary case documents to Japan, meaning Japanese police had no legal grounds to detain him. In August 1986, just 5 years after his crime, Issei Sagawa walked out of the hospital a free man. What he did next is almost as shocking as the murder itself. Issei didn't disappear into obscurity, hiding from his past. He embraced his infamy, turning himself into a bizarre kind of celebrity. He wrote multiple books about his crime, including a memoir titled In the Fog, which described the murder and cannibalism in graphic detail. He appeared on Japanese talk shows, his small frame and soft voice a stark contrast to the horror of his story. He starred in exploitation films, playing roles that leaned into his cannibalistic persona. He even reviewed restaurants for Spa, a Japanese magazine, as if his past was a quirky footnote in a colorful career. Issei's celebrity status sparked outrage, particularly among Renée Hardevelt's family, who were forced to watch him profit from their daughter's death. In Japan, opinions were divided. Some saw him as a curiosity, a real-life monster whose story was too bizarre to ignore. Others were disgusted, calling for his rearrest. But legally, there was nothing to be done. Issei lived freely in Tokyo, his apartment filled with books and artwork, his life a strange blend of normalcy and notoriety. He gave interviews, posed for photos, and spoke openly about his desire to eat human flesh again, though he claimed he never acted on it. Up until his death on November 24, 2022, from pneumonia at the age of 73, Issei Sagawa remained free. His story is a chilling indictment of a justice system that failed to hold him accountable, a reminder that some crimes are so heinous they defy punishment. Renée Hardevelt's memory lives on in the grief of her family, while Issei's legacy is one of infamy, a man who turned murder into a spectacle. His freedom raises questions that linger like a bad dream. How does someone like Issei slip through the cracks? And what does it say about a society that allowed him thrive? Pedro Alonzo Lopez, the monster of the Andes. Our next story takes us to the rugged, mist-shrouded peaks and sprawling valleys of South America, where one man's name still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who hears it. Pedro Alonzo Lopez. His story is a nightmare made flesh, a tale of unimaginable horror that spans continents and decades. It's a story that begins in tragedy, spirals into depravity, and ends with a question mark that still haunts investigators today. Let's step into the darkness and meet the man who may be the most prolific serial killer in history, and who, unbelievably, walks free. Let's travel back to 1948, to a small impoverished town in Colombia, where a boy named Pedro Alonzo Lopez was born into a world that seemed designed to break him. The seventh of 13 children, Pedro grew up in a cramped, chaotic home raised by his mother, Benilda, a prostitute who worked to keep her family fed. From a young age, Pedro was exposed to the raw, unfiltered reality of his mother's profession. He saw men come and go, heard the sounds of transactions through thin walls, and learned early that love and survival were tangled in ways a child's mind couldn't untangle. These experiences didn't just shape him. They scarred him, planting seeds of confusion and rage that would grow into something monstrous. By the time he was 8, Pedro's life took a turn that would set him on a collision course with evil. His mother caught him sexually assaulting his younger sister, an act that, while horrific, was likely a warped reflection of the abuse and exposure he'd endured. Benilda's response was swift and brutal. She cast him out, banishing her son to the streets of Bogotá with nothing but the clothes on his back. Imagine it. A child, barely old enough to understand the world, left to fend for himself in a city teeming with danger. Bogotá in the 1950s was no place for a vulnerable boy. Poverty, violence, and corruption were rampant, and Pedro became an easy prey. On the streets, he faced horrors that would break most adults. He was sexually abused by strangers, beaten by gangs, and forced to scavenge for scraps to survive. The trauma hardened his heart, fueling a rage that simmered beneath the surface. He learned to survive by any means necessary, stealing food, picking pockets, and dodging the police. By the time he was a teenager, Pedro Alonzo Lopez was no longer the scared boy who'd been cast out. He was a survivor, a criminal, and a young man on the brink of something far more dangerous. By his teens, he'd turned to crime, stealing cars and selling them to chop shops. It was a small step from petty theft to a life of lawlessness. And in his late teens, Pedro's crimes caught up with him. At 18, he was arrested for stealing cars and selling them to chop shops, a lucrative hustle in Bogota's underworld. The judge sentenced him to prison, and it was behind bars that Pedro's descent into darkness truly began. Colombian prisons in the 1960s were brutal, overcrowded, and ruled by violence, a place where any remaining shred of humanity would be stripped away. For a young inmate like Pedro, survival meant navigating a hierarchy of predators. Early in his sentence, he became the target of a gang of inmates who saw him as an easy mark. They cornered him, attacked him, and gang raped him. An assault that left him humiliated and seething with fury. Most people would have been crushed by such an experience. For Pedro, it was a turning point. He made a vow to himself. He would never be a victim again. Over the next few weeks, he tracked down each of his attackers within the prison walls. One by one, he killed them. He stabbed them with makeshift blade, his hands steady, his eyes cold. These weren't acts of self-defense. They were cold, calculated murders, each one feeding a growing hunger for control and vengeance. By the time he left prison, Pedro wasn't just a criminal. He was a killer, and the world was about to pay the price. Released in the early 1970s, Lopez didn't return to a life of petty crime. Instead, he became a nomad, a shadow slipping across borders with a singular, horrifying purpose: to kill. He traveled through Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, targeting young girls, some as young as 9, who were vulnerable, often poor, and unlikely to be missed. His method was chillingly simple. He'd charm or lure them with promises of food or money, then lead them to isolated spots where he'd rape and murder them, often strangling them with his bare hands. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves, hidden in the dense jungles or remote mountains of the Andes. Pedro later claimed he killed over 300 people, averaging 3 murders a week at his peak. A number so staggering it's hard to grasp. If true, it would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history, surpassing even the likes of Ted Bundy or Gary Ridgway. He later described these killings with a chilling detachment, as if he were recounting a mundane routine. For him, murder wasn't just an act. It was an art form, a ritual that fed his darkest desires. His killing spree might have gone on indefinitely if not for one critical mistake. In April 1980, in the Ecuadorian town of Ambato, Pedro approached a young girl in a bustling marketplace. He tried to lure her away using the same tactics that had worked so many times before. But this time, the girl's mother was watching. She saw the stranger talking to her daughter, sensed something was wrong, and screamed for help. Bystanders rushed to her aid, surrounding Pedro and holding him until the police arrived. For the first time in Ecuador, the monster of the Andes was caught. In custody, Pedro didn't just confess, he boasted. He sat across from stunned investigators, his voice calm and steady, and told them he had killed up to 300 people, mostly young girls. He described his methods in gruesome detail, how he chose his victims, how he killed them, where he buried their bodies. He spoke of shallow graves in forests, riverbanks where he dumped remains, and remote fields where no one would look. The police were skeptical. 300 murders? It sounded like the ravings of a madman, a deranged criminal seeking attention. They were ready to dismiss his claims until nature itself intervened. In a stroke of grim serendipity, a flash flood swept through a remote area of Ecuador shortly after Pedro's arrest. The waters churned through valleys and hillsides, unearthing a mass grave exactly where Pedro had described. Dozens of bodies, young girls, their remains weathered by time and earth, were uncovered in the mud. The discovery was a gut punch to the authorities. Pedro Alonzo Lopez wasn't lying. He was the monster of the Andes, and his body count was unlike anything they'd ever seen. The news sent shockwaves across South America. Parents locked their doors. Communities lived in fear. The question on everyone's mind was, how had this gone on for so long? Pedro was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to prison in Ecuador. At the time, Ecuador's penal system had a maximum sentence of 16 years, regardless of the crime. A policy rooted in the country's laws and strained prison resources. For a man who had confessed to hundreds of killings, it was a shockingly lenient punishment. But even that sentence wouldn't hold him for long. In 1994, after serving 14 years, he was released, only to be arrested an hour later by Colombian authorities on an immigration violation. But instead of facing a new trial for his countless crimes, he was declared insane and committed to a mental hospital in Bogotá. The diagnosis was convenient, a way to sidestep the complexities of prosecuting a man whose crimes spanned multiple countries. In 1998, after just 4 years in the hospital, Pedro was released on a mere $70 bail. His only condition was to check in with authorities regularly, a condition he promptly ignored. The moment he walked out of that hospital, Pedro Alonzo Lopez vanished. He became a ghost, slipping through the cracks of a fractured justice system. No trace, no record, no clue where he went. Some believe he fled to Europe, blending into the anonymity of a foreign continent. Others think he's still in South America, hiding in plain sight in the crowded streets of Lima, Bogotá, or Quito. And then there's the most chilling possibility of all, that Pedro never stopped killing. Between 2002 and 2012, a series of murders in Colombia bore an eerie resemblance to his signature style. Young girls strangled or stabbed, their bodies left in remote areas. The cases remain unsolved, the killer unidentified. Coincidence? Or is the monster of the Andes still out there, hunting in the shadows? As we speak, Pedro Alonzo Lopez is free. He could be anywhere, sipping coffee in a cafe, walking through a market, watching from the edge of a crowd. He could be anyone. A nondescript man with a quiet demeanor, his past buried beneath a lifetime of lies. The thought is terrifying, a reminder that some monsters don't stay caged. Pedro's story is a haunting question mark, a case that defies closure. How many more lives did he take? Where is he now? And what will it take to finally stop him? Kathy Wood, the lethal lover. Our final story brings us to the quiet tree-lined streets of Fort Mill, South Carolina, a small town where life moves slowly and neighbors know each other by name. In January 2020, the residents of Fort Mill were about to get a new neighbor, someone who would shatter their sense of safety. Her name was Kathy Wood, one half of the infamous Lethal Lovers, a duo responsible for a killing spree that turned a Michigan nursing home into a house of horrors. When the community learned who was moving in, shock rippled through the town. One resident told local news, "It's just kind of shocking, really. And trust me, they had every reason to be afraid." To understand Kathy Wood's crimes, we need to travel back to 1986, to Alpine Manor, a nursing home in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Alpine Manor was a place of care, where elderly residents with Alzheimer's and dementia spent their final days. The staff were dedicated, the atmosphere warm, at least on the surface. Among the nurses' aides was Kathy Wood, a 26-year-old woman with a friendly smile and a reputation for being reliable. She was well-liked by her co-workers and seemed to have a genuine affection for the residents. But beneath her cheerful exterior, Kathy was hiding a darkness that would soon consume everything in its path. In 1986, Kathy met Gwendolyn Graham, a 25-year-old nurse's aide who had recently started at Alpine Manor. Gwendolyn, or Gwen as she was called, was charismatic and confident, with a knack for making people feel at ease. She and Kathy hit it off immediately, their friendship blossoming into something more. Within weeks, they were inseparable, their bond growing intense and obsessive. They spent every moment together, whispering in the break room, stealing glances in the hallways. To those around them, they seemed like two young women in love, caught up in the excitement of a new relationship. But their love was built on something far darker. A shared desire to prove their devotion in the most twisted way imaginable. Kathy and Gwen didn't just want to be together. They wanted to cement their bond with an act so extreme, so irreversible, that it would bind them forever. They decided to kill. Not for money, not for revenge, but for love. To them, murder was the ultimate expression of loyalty. A secret they would share. A pact that would make their relationship unbreakable. Their victims were the most vulnerable people in their care. Elderly patients with Alzheimer's or dementia, people who couldn't fight back, couldn't scream for help, couldn't even remember what was happening to them. Kathy and Gwen saw them as perfect targets, pawns in their sick game. According to Kathy, the killings began in early 1987. Gwen would choose a patient, someone frail and disoriented, and slip into their room at night. She would place a pillow or a cloth over the patient's face, pressing down until their struggles ceased. Kathy's role was to stand and watch, distracting other staff members or ensuring no one entered the room. The act was quick, silent, and chillingly efficient. The patients' deaths were often attributed to natural causes. After all, they were elderly, their health already fragile. No one suspected that two trusted caregivers were orchestrating a murder spree. But the killings weren't random. Kathy and Gwen added a layer of depravity to their crimes that still sends chills down the spine. They chose their victims based on the initials of their last names, with a chilling goal: to spell out the word murder with the first letters of their victims' names. It was a game, a puzzle they were piecing together with human lives. They would select a patient whose last name started with M, then U, then R, and so on, working toward their twisted masterpiece. They got as far as 5 confirmed kills before abandoning the plan, reportedly because some of their attempts failed when patients fought back. But some believe they targeted as many as 12 residents, their full body count hidden by the chaos of a busy nursing home. The victims were people with advanced dementia. These were women who had lived long, full lives, only to have their final moments stolen by 2 people they trusted. The families of the victims were left with vague explanations: heart failure, respiratory issues, never suspecting the truth. Kathy and Gwen, meanwhile, reveled in their secret. They would giggle in the hallways, exchange knowing glances, their bond strengthened by the lives they'd taken. Their killing spree might have gone unnoticed if not for one man, Kathy's ex-husband, Ken Wood. In early 1987, during a moment of vulnerability, Kathy confessed to Ken about the murders. She told him how she and Gwen had killed elderly patients, how it was part of their love bond. She begged him not to tell anyone, swearing it was a mistake, a secret he had to keep. Ken, torn between loyalty to his ex-wife and horror at what she'd done, stayed silent for 14 months. But the weight of the confession was too much. He couldn't stop thinking about the families of the victims, the lives that had been stolen, the justice that was being denied. In October 1988, Ken went to the police. He sat down with detectives and recounted everything Kathy had told him, his voice trembling as he described the murders. The police were skeptical at first. Murders in a nursing home? By 2 young women who seemed so caring? It was almost unthinkable. But they launched an investigation, focusing on the deaths at Alpine Manor between January and April 1987, the period Kathy had mentioned. Of the 40 patient deaths during that time, 8 raised red flags. The police exhumed 2 bodies, finding evidence of suffocation that pointed to foul play. In December 1988, Kathy Wood and Gwendolyn Graham were arrested in connection with the deaths of 2 patients, Marguerite Chambers and Edith Cook. The arrests sent shockwaves through Grand Rapids. The idea that 2 nurses' aides had been killing patients for fun was incomprehensible. Facing the possibility of life in prison, Kathy made a calculated move. She turned on Gwen, offering to testify against her in exchange for a plea deal. She claimed she had only acted as a lookout, distracting staff while Gwen committed the murders. It was Gwen's idea, she said. Kathy's testimony painted a chilling picture. She described how they chose their victims, how they planned each killing, how they laughed about it afterward. She admitted to the murder game, though she claimed they never completed it. Her cooperation earned her a reduced sentence. In 1989, Kathy pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, receiving a sentence of 20 to 40 years. Gwen, convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder, was sentenced to life without parole. She remains in a Michigan women's prison to this day, her name synonymous with betrayal and cruelty. But Kathy's story didn't end behind bars. After serving nearly 30 years, she began applying for parole in 2005. Her first 8 attempts were denied, the parole board citing the severity of her crimes and the pain she'd caused. But in September 2018, against the protests of the victims' families and Michigan's Attorney General, the board granted her early release. On January 16, 2020, Kathy Wood walked out of prison a free woman. The decision sparked outrage. Families of the victims, who had spent decades grappling with their loss, were horrified. They feared Kathy could kill again, that her time in prison hadn't erased the darkness inside her. Kathy moved in with her sister in Fort Mill, South Carolina, a town far removed from the horrors of Alpine Manor. She kept a low profile, avoiding the media and blending into the community. But her presence didn't go unnoticed. Local news outlets broke the story, and residents were stunned to learn they were living next to a convicted killer. Some expressed sympathy, believing Kathy had served her time and deserved a second chance. Others were terrified, unable to trust someone who had once killed for pleasure. The question lingered. Had Kathy Wood truly changed, or was she biding her time, waiting for another opportunity to strike? The families of her victims have no doubts. The true scope of the lethal lover's crimes may never be known, a shadow that hangs over Kathy's release. Kathy Wood's freedom raises haunting questions. Can someone who killed for fun ever be rehabilitated? Should society forgive a woman who betrayed her victim's trust in the most horrific way? And what does it mean to live in a world where someone like Kathy can walk free, her past a footnote in a quiet suburban life? Her story is a stark reminder that justice is not always black and white, and that the line between punishment and redemption is razor thin. If these stories sent shivers down your spine, don't keep it to yourself. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Should these killers have been freed? Do you think they're still a threat? Hit that like button if you want more chilling true crime deep dives, and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss a video. Share this with your true crime crew, and let's get the conversation going, because the scariest monsters might be closer than you think. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.